I never planned on working for the notorious Conor McGregor. With a master's degree in sports psychology and 3 years of experience at a high-performance athletics center in Boston, my career trajectory seemed set, consulting with collegiate athletes, perhaps eventually landing a position with a professional. When the economy contracted and my position was eliminated, I found myself scrolling through job listings with increasing desperation. The position description is intentionally vague. Performance psychology assistant for elite combat sports athlete, Las Vegas, Josh Dublin. Extensive travel required, strict confidentiality essential. The salary was triple what I'd been making at the athletics center, but the listing seemed suspiciously light on detail. Still, with student loans and rent due, I submitted my application without much expectation. The interview process was unlike anything I'd experienced. 3 rounds of increasingly intensive questions, each requiring additional non-disclosure. Only in the final interview, conducted via encrypted video call, was the potential employer revealed. Conor McGregor, former UFC double champion, one of the highest-paid athletes in the world, and perhaps the most polarizing figure in combat sports. "Let me be clear about what this position is not," said John, McGregor's operations director, who conducted the final interview. "This is not a traditional sports psychology. Mr. McGregor doesn't need someone telling him to visualize success or practice positive affirmation. He's looking for someone to help implement and maintain specific psychological frameworks he's developed, systems that require technical understanding and precise execution." When I asked about specific responsibilities, John's response was intriguingly cryptic. "Conor has developed certain approaches to performance psychology that diverge significantly from conventional methods. Your role would be helping maintain these and measuring their effectiveness across various contexts, not just fighting, but business, media appearance, negotiation, and other high-pressure situations." 2 weeks later, I landed at Dublin Airport, still somewhat in disbelief. As the driver transported me to McGregor's estate outside the city, I mentally rehearsed what I knew about the fighter, the meteoric rise from collecting welfare checks to becoming the biggest star in UFC history, the precise, almost prescient fight, the unshakable self-belief that seemed to border on delusion until repeatedly proven accurate, the carefully crafted public persona that oscillated between luxury-obsessed showman and philosophical warrior poet. What I couldn't have anticipated was that over the next year, I would witness something far more sophisticated than the brash confidence portrayed in media, a meticulously engineered psychological framework that systematically reconstructed reality perception, decision-making process, and identity structures in ways that transformed potential into performance with remarkable consistency. This wasn't the stereotypical believe-in-yourself mantras or visualization techniques taught in conventional sports psychology. It was something far more technical and precise, an integrated system for reality construction that McGregor had developed intuitively through his fighting career, then methodically refined into explicit protocols that could be strategically implemented across domains. And it would completely transform my understanding of confidence, performance, and the psychological mechanisms that separate those who merely attempt greatness from those who actually. Chapter 2. First Impression. My first day began at 7:30 a.m., earlier than expected for someone with McGregor's reputation for late-night extravagant parties. I was met by Sarah, McGregor's chief of staff, who led me through the expansive estate to what staff called the strategy room, a space I assumed would be focused on fight tactic or business planning. Instead, I discovered something entirely unexpected, a sophisticated workspace that resembled a combination of cognitive science laboratory, media analysis center, and strategic communications. Multiple large screens displayed data visualizations and content analysis. Whiteboards covered with intricate diagrams lined the walls. The space contained none of the fight memorabilia or luxury items that dominated McGregor's social media presence. "Conor will join us at 8 hours," Sarah explained. "Until then, familiarize yourself with these materials. They'll provide context for your role." She handed me a tablet containing several documents with curious titles: reality construction frameworks, calibrated response sequence, environmental priming protocols, and identity leverage system. Before I could begin reviewing them, the door opened. Conor McGregor entered precisely at 8 a.m. My immediate impression challenged everything I thought I knew about the man. The bombastic, larger-than-life persona from press conferences and social media was entirely absent. He was dressed simply in training clothes, no designer labels, no flashy watches, no entourage. Most striking was his demeanor, focused, measured, and intensely present, with none of the manic energy that characterized his public appearances. "You must be Ryan," he said, his Irish accent less pronounced than in interviews. "Welcome to the team. Sarah says your background in cognitive psychology makes you well suited for what we're doing here." "Thank you for the opportunity," I replied, maintaining professional composure despite my internal recalibration. I'm looking forward to understanding your approach to performance psychology. Performance psychology, McGregor repeated, as if considering the term. That's what outsiders would call it, I suppose. We don't use that framework here. What we're doing is reality engineering, developing systems to reconstruct how situations are perceived, processed, and transformed into action. He gestured to the materials on the tablet. Those documents outline the core framework. They'll seem abstract initially, but you'll see their practical application as we move forward. Today, observe the morning protocol sequence. It's the foundation for everything else. With that brief introduction, McGregor moved to a specific position where Sarah had set up what appeared to be a customized environment, particular lighting configuration, sound isolation, and several monitors like data feeds rather than. For the next 45 minutes, I observed as McGregor engaged in what I would later learn was called state calibration, a precisely structured sequence of cognitive, linguistic, and physiological practice that looked nothing like traditional pre-training routines. This wasn't motivation or focus building in any conventional, but a systematic process of reconfiguring perceptual filters and response thresholds according to specific parameters. Most striking was how this practice diverged from the stereotypical pre-fight psychology I'd studied in graduate school. There were no aggression-inducing motivational videos, no visualization of victory, none of the emotional amping up typically associated with combat. Instead, McGregor moved through technical protocols that seemed designed to establish precise cognitive and perceptual conditions rather than generate emotional states. When the sequence concluded, McGregor turned to me with an expression of clinical interest. "What did you observe?" he asked. Caught slightly off guard by the direct question, I offered my immediate impression. It seems more like cognitive calibration than conventional motivation or focus building, almost like establishing specific parameters for information process rather than generating an emotional state. A slight smile crossed his face. Precisely. Emotional states are unreliable, too dependent on external variables, too subject to fluctuation. What you just witnessed was the establishment of specific perceptual filters and response thresholds that remain stable regardless of circumstantial variation. He continued, revealing the first glimpse of the sophisticated framework I would spend the next year helping implement. The conventional approach treats confidence as an emotional state to be generated through motivation or affirmation. That creates fundamental vulnerability. When circumstances change, the state dissipates. True confidence isn't an emotional state. It's a perceptual framework, a specific way of filtering and processing reality that remains consistent regardless of external conditions. As McGregor left for his morning training set, Sarah explained my immediate responsibilities, documenting baseline measurements from the morning protocol, preparing specific materials for the afternoon session, and beginning to familiarize myself with the core frameworks outlined in the tablet document. Throughout that first day, as I observed additional protocol sequences and reviewed the technical materials, a clear pattern emerged that contradicted everything I thought I knew about McGregor's psychological approach. The brash confidence that defined his public persona wasn't the product of emotional self-belief or motivational techniques, but emerged from sophisticated systems for reality perception and information process that had been meticulously developed and refined. Most revealing was a comment from John, the operations director, who had initially interviewed me during an orientation session that afternoon. The Conor McGregor you see in press conferences and social media isn't the person, it's the product. Everything you've observed about his confidence, his prediction, his seeming immunity to pressure, none of it is based on emotional states or natural temperament. It's all engineered through systematic frameworks that can be implemented, measured, and optimized like any other technical skill. By the end of my first day, I understood that I had fundamentally misunderstood the psychological foundations of McGregor's success. The legendary confidence that defined his career wasn't a personality trait or emotional characteristic, but the output of sophisticated systems for reality construction that he had developed with the same technical precision he brought to his fighting. What I couldn't yet grasp was how exactly these systems function, how the abstract frameworks outlined in the documents translated into the remarkable performance characteristics that had transformed McGregor from an unknown fighter on welfare to one of the most successful athletes in combat sports history. As I would discover in the months ahead, the answer involved far more technical sophistication than I had ever expected from a fighter known primarily for his knockout power and promotional flair. Chapter 3. The Reality Construction. By my third week working with McGregor's team, I had begun to understand the fundamental framework that underpinned his psychological approach, what internal documents called the Reality Construction, RCS. This wasn't simply a collection of motivational techniques or confidence-building exercises, but a comprehensive methodology for reconstructing how situations were perceived, processed, and transformed into action. My deepening understanding came through direct involvement in implementing daily protocols and measuring their effectiveness across various contexts. The system's sophistication became apparent during preparation for a high-stakes business negotiation, an 8-figure licensing deal that represented McGregor's first major entry into a particular consumer category. Today, you'll observe the complete RCS implementation, McGregor told me as we entered the strategy room at 6:30 a.m., several hours before the scheduled negotiation. The framework is identical whether preparing for a championship fight, business negotiation, or media confrontation. Only the specific variables are adjusted. What followed was a methodical 3-hour process that revealed the technical core of what the public perceived as McGregor's natural confidence. The process consisted of 3 distinct phases, each addressing different aspects of psychological performance. The first phase, called perceptual reconstruction, involved systematically reconfiguring how the upcoming situation would be perceived. This wasn't simple positive thinking or reframing, but a precise protocol for restructuring perception according to specific parameters. Using a combination of cognitive techniques, linguistic patterns, and environmental priming, McGregor methodically reconstructed his perception of the negotiation, not as external reality to be confronted, but as space to be defined according to his parameters. Conventional psychology approaches reality as fixed, McGregor explained, as he moved through specific exercises. You're taught to adapt to situations, to cope with pressure, to manage circumstances. That framework contains a fundamental surrender, accepting that reality exists independently and your role is merely response. The alternative is recognizing that perception creates reality, not the other way around. He continued, articulating a perspective that challenged my formal training. What we call reality is actually a construction process. The negotiation doesn't exist as an objective event. It exists as whatever we construct it to be. This protocol isn't about preparing for their reality. It's about establishing the parameter of perception so thoroughly that our construction becomes the dominant reality. The second phase, termed response calibration, focused on establishing specific cognitive and physiological patterns that would automatically activate during the negotiation. This wasn't about planning specific responses to anticipated scenarios, but programming generalized response patterns that would function regardless of how events unfolded. Most striking about this phase was how it inverted conventional performance psychology. Rather than preparing responses to potential situations, McGregor was establishing internal patterns so specific that external circumstances would naturally organize around them, creating what he called response inevitability rather than response preparation. The conventional approach is reactive, anticipating situations and preparing responses, he noted, as he engaged in precisely structured linguistic and physiological exercises. That creates fundamental vulnerability because you can never anticipate every potential circumstance. This system establishes internal patterns so specific that external events naturally conform to them rather than the reverse. The third phase, called identity activation, was perhaps the most fascinating. Rather than simply adopting a confident mindset or motivational state, McGregor engaged in a systematic process of activating specific identity structures that had been previously engineered for particular performance. Identity isn't fixed, it's contextual, he explained, moving through protocols that appeared to shift his entire demeanor, linguistic patterns, and physical presence. Most people operate from a continuous identity, trying to maintain consistency across contexts. That creates unnecessary limitation. This system activates specific identity configuration optimized for particular performance requirements. What I witnessed wasn't role-playing or surface-level personality shifting, but something far more fundamental: the systematic activation of entirely different operating systems depending on performance requirements. The Conor McGregor preparing for a business negotiation functioned through different perceptual filters, response thresholds, and identity structure than the Conor McGregor who would prepare for a championship fight or major media appearance. As the preparations concluded and McGregor prepared to leave for the negotiation, he offered an insight that illuminated the entire framework. Confidence, as conventionally understood, is a psychological state dependent on external validation and internal emotion. True confidence is a construction-specific way of generating reality rather than responding. What you've observed isn't preparation for performance, but the establishment of conditions that make certain forms of performance inevitable. In the weeks that followed, I observed how this reality construction system was implemented across diverse contexts: training sessions, media appearances, business meetings, even casual social interaction. While the specific variables were adjusted based on performance requirements, the core methodology remained consistent: systematically reconstructing perception, calibrating response patterns, and activating context-optimized identity structure. Most revealing was how this system explained what the public perceived as McGregor's unshakable confidence. This wasn't psychological resilience in the conventional, the ability to maintain belief despite challenges or setbacks. It was something more fundamental, a comprehensive framework for reality construction that operated independently of external circumstances or emotional states. Conventional confidence is reactive. It exists in response to evidence or requires ongoing maintenance through affirmation, McGregor explained during a debrief session following a particular successful media appearance. The system we've developed is generative. It creates the conditions specific performance inevitably emerges, regardless of circumstance. By my second month, I recognized that the frameworks I was helping implement represented a fundamental inversion of traditional performance psychology. Rather than developing technique to perform better within existing reality framework, McGregor had created systems for reconstructing reality itself, establishing perceptual conditions where his specific forms of performance became natural expression rather than effortful achievement. And this insight helped explain one of the most distinctive characteristics of McGregor's career: his seemingly preternatural ability to predict specific fight outcomes, often down to the exact round and method of victory. These weren't guesses or even strategic projections. They were the natural extensions of reality construction, so thoroughly established that specific outcomes became perceptually inevitable rather than merely possible or probable. What the world perceived as borderline delusional confidence was actually the external manifestation of sophisticated reality construction frameworks for perception, response, and identity that had been meticulously engineered to generate specific performance outcomes regardless of conventional circumstantial limitations. This wasn't the psychology of self-belief I had studied in graduate programs. It was something far more technical and precise, a comprehensive methodology for reality engineering that transformed potential into performance with remarkable consistency across radically different domains and challenges. Chapter 4. The Calibrated Response Protocol. 4 months into working with McGregor's team, I gained deeper insight into another critical component of his psychological framework, what internal documents called the Calibrated Response Protocol, CRP. This wasn't simply emotional regulation or stress management as understood in conventional psychology, but a sophisticated system for establishing specific response patterns that functioned automatically under diverse performance conditions. My understanding of this framework deepened through direct involvement in implementing the protocol during preparation for a major media conference, a face-to-face interview with a journalist known for provocative questioning and attempts to unsettle guests. Rather than conventional media training focused on message discipline or anticipated questions, McGregor's preparation involved a technical approach to response patterning that revealed another dimension of his psychological methodology. Today you'll document the complete CRP implementation, McGregor instructed as we entered the strategy room at 5:45 a.m., several hours before the scheduled interview. This protocol addresses a fundamental performance limitation, the gap between intended response and actual response under pressure. What followed was a methodical 2-hour process that illuminated a core component of what the public perceived as McGregor's unshakable composure and tactical precision under pressure. The protocol consisted of 3 integrated phases, each addressing different aspects of response calibration. The first phase, called threshold mapping, involved systematically identifying and categorizing potential trigger points across multiple dimensions: verbal provocation, physical proxemics, temporal pressures, and status dynamics. Rather than simply anticipating specific questions or scenarios, this process mapped general categories of potential disruption according to their underlying psychological mechanism. Conventional preparation focuses on content, what might be said or asked, McGregor explained as he moved through this mapping process with remarkable precision. That approach creates fundamental vulnerability because content is infinitely variable. This system focuses instead on structural patterns, the underlying mechanisms that operate regardless specific content. The second phase, termed response sequencing, was perhaps the most technically sophisticated. Rather than planning specific replies to anticipated provocation, McGregor engaged in a systematic process of establishing specific neurological sequences that would activate automatically when map thresholds were crossed. This wasn't rehearsed response, but programmed pattern, creating what he called response inevitability through precise neurological conditioning. What fascinated me about this phase was how it integrated cognitive, linguistic, and physiological elements into unified response pattern. Using a combination of specific breathing technique, linguistic frameworks, and attentional positioning, McGregor methodically established response sequences that would activate automatically under specific conditions without requiring conscious management. The conventional approach treats response as a conscious choice made in the moment, he noted as he engaged in precisely structured conditioning exercise. That creates inherent vulnerability because conscious processing is too slow and unreliable under pressure. This system establishes pre-configured response patterns that activate automatically when specific thresholds are crossed, bypassing conscious deliberation entirely. The third phase, called state transition management, focused on maintaining pattern integrity across different emotional and physiological states. Rather than attempting to suppress or control emotional responses, the typical approach in media training, McGregor systematically practiced maintaining specific response patterns across deliberately induced state variation. Most performance deterioration occurs during state transition, he explained, as he moved through exercises that alternated between different physiological and emotional conditions. When internal state changes through adrenaline, anger, surprise, temporal pressure, response patterns typically fragment. This protocol establishes pattern that persists regardless of state variation. As the preparations concluded, McGregor offered an insight that illuminated a framework. Composure, as conventionally understood, means suppressing authentic response, maintain a deliberate presentation. True composure response establishes patterns that express them consistent across varying conditions without requiring. In the interview that followed, I observed the protocol's effectiveness with new. When the journalist attempted several provocations, questioning McGregor's legitimacy in specific business ventures, referencing past controversies, even making subtle insinuations about his fighting future, the response patterns I had witnessed being established that morning activated with remarkable precision. This wasn't rehearsed messaging or emotional discipline, but the automatic execution of pre-established neurological sequences that required no conscious management. Most revealing was a moment when the journalist made a particularly provocative comment designed to trigger an emotional response. I observed a specific physiological pattern. Activate. A subtle shift in breathing, a momentary eye movement sequence, a particular postural adjustment that corresponded exactly to transitions I had documented during the morning protocol. What followed wasn't suppressed emotion or forced composure, but a response of such natural precision that it completely redirected interaction dynamics while appearing entirely spontaneous. In the weeks that followed, I observed how this calibrated response protocol was implemented across diverse contexts, fighting scenarios, business negotiations, unexpected public encounters, even interpersonal conflict, while the specific thresholds and response patterns were calibrated based on contextual requirements. The core methodology remained consistent, systematically mapping potential disruption paths, establishing automatic response sequences, and ensuring patterning across state transition. Most significant was how this system explained what the public perceived as McGregor's tactical precision under pressure. This wasn't quick thinking or natural charisma as commonly assumed, but the expression of sophisticated response patterns that had been meticulously engineered to activate automatically under specific conditions without requiring the conscious process that becomes compromised under pressure. Conventional performance psychology treats pressure as something to be managed or overcome, McGregor explained during a debrief session following a particularly challenging business negotiation. That framework contains a fundamental error, assuming that optimal response can emerge from conscious process under pressure. The reality is that pressure inherently compromises conscious process. The solution isn't better management of consciousness, but establishing response patterns that function independently of conscious direction. By my fifth month, I understood that the frameworks I was helping implement represented a fundamental reinvention of performance psychology. Rather than developing better techniques for conscious performance management under pressure, the focus of most sports psychology, McGregor had created systems for establishing specific response patterns that functioned automatically, bypassing the limitations of conscious processing entirely. And this insight helped explain another distinctive characteristic of McGregor's career: his remarkable tactical precision in chaotic fighting scenarios, high-pressure negotiations, and volatile media confrontation. What observers attributed to natural talent or spontaneous brilliance was actually the expression of meticulously engineered response patterns, systems so thoroughly established that they functioned automatically under precisely the conditions that typically compromise conscious performance. What the world interpreted as unshakable composure or tactical genius was the external manifestation of sophisticated response calibration, frameworks for automatic pattern execution that had been systematically developed to function optimally under exactly the pressure conditions that typically produce performance degradation. This wasn't the pressure management or emotional regulation I had studied in conventional psychology. It was something far more technical and precise, a comprehensive methodology for establishing response inevitability that transformed potential reactions into consistent expression regardless of circumstantial or emotional variation. Chapter 5. The Identity Leverage. 5 months into working with McGregor's team, I gained insight into perhaps the most fascinating component of his psychological framework, what internal documents called the Identity Leverage System, ILS. This wasn't personality development or character building as understood in traditional psychology, but a sophisticated approach to engineering and deploying specific identity configurations optimized for particular performance. My deepening understanding came through direct involvement in implementing the protocol during preparation for a complex business negotiation that required navigating between multiple stakeholder groups with divergent. Rather than conventional negotiation training focused on tactics or bargaining, McGregor's preparation involved a technical approach to identity configuration that revealed another dimension of his psychological methodology. Today, you'll document the complete ILS implementation, McGregor instructed as we entered a specialized preparation space at 6:15 a.m. This protocol addresses a fundamental performance, the limitation of operating from fixed identity structure across variable performance requirements. What followed was a methodical process that illuminated a core component of what the public perceived as McGregor's chameleon-like ability to excel across radically different domains, from fighting to business to media to high society social context. The protocol consisted of 3 integrated phases, each addressing different aspects of identity engineering. The first phase, called identity deconstruction, involved systematically dismantling default identity patterns and associated behavioral constraints. This wasn't simple role flexibility or contextual adaptation, but a fundamental decoupling of identity from fixed structure, creating what McGregor called identity fluidity as the foundation for subsequent reconfiguration. Conventional psychology treats identity as a core construct to be developed and maintained. McGregor explained as he engaged in specific exercises designed to create this decoupled state. That framework contains a fundamental limitation, assuming that optimal performance emerges from identity expression. The alternative is recognizing that different content require different identity configuration, each optimal specific requirement. The second phase, termed configuration, was the most technically sophisticated. Rather than adopting generalized mindsets or emotional states, McGregor engaged in a precise process of constructing specific identity configurations assembled from modular components. Particular linguistic patterns, decision framework, value hierarchies, perceptual filters, and response thresholds combined into integrated operating systems optimized for the particular negotiation context. What fascinated me about this phase was how it transcended conventional understanding of role adaptation or contextual behavior. This wasn't playing a part or adjusting presentation style, but systematically constructing a complete operating architecture from which performance would emerge naturally rather than through deliberate execution. Most people attempt to adapt behavior while maintaining continuous identity, McGregor noted as he moved through this configuration process with remarkable precision. That creates inherent friction, constantly adjusting output while operating through fixed processing structure. This system reconfigures the underlying operating architecture itself, eliminating the friction between identity and expression. The third phase, called embodiment integration, focused on transferring the constructed configuration from conceptual framework to embodied expression. Using a combination of specific physiological techniques, environmental anchoring, and simulated interactions, McGregor methodically integrated the configured identity into full-spectrum expression, creating what he called natural emergence rather than deliberate performance. Conventional approaches create perpetual translation requirements, converting intention into expression through conscious management, he explained, as he engaged in sophisticated integration exercises. That creates performance limitation because translation gives processing capacity better allocated to direct response. This protocol eliminates translation requirements by establishing complete configuration integration. Performance emerges directly without requiring conscious mediation. As the preparation sequence concluded, McGregor offered an insight that illuminated the entire framework. Authenticity, as conventionally understood, means consistent expression of fixed identity, regardless of context. True authenticity is functional alignment, operating through identity configurations precisely matched to contextual requirements, so performance emerges naturally without distortion or effort. In the negotiation that followed, I observed the system's effectiveness with McGregor navigated between multiple stakeholder groups with remarkable fluidity, shifting linguistic patterns, decision framework, even physical presence established immediate resonance in each different group without appearing calculated or manipulated. This wasn't social chameleonism or practiced adaptation, but the natural expression of specific identity configurations optimized for each particular interaction dynamic. Most revealing was observing the transitions between these configurations. When moving between stakeholder groups with fundamentally different values and communications, I witnessed specific transition sequences activate brief calibration patterns that facilitated clean shifts between identity configurations without the dissonance or inconsistency that typically accompanies role adaptation. In the weeks that followed, I observed how this identity leverage system was implemented across diverse contexts, fighting scenarios, media appearance, business operation, celebrity social function, even intimate conversation. While the specific configurations varied based on performance requirements, the core methodology remained consistent, systematically deconstructing fixed identity patterns, assembling context-optimized configurations, and integrating these configurations into natural expression. Most significant was how this system explained what many considered McGregor's most remarkable capability: his unprecedented success across domains that typically require entirely different skill sets and psychological orientation. This wasn't versatility in the conventional, the ability to adapt behavior across contexts, but something more fundamental: the capacity to operate through entirely different identity structures optimal for each domain's specific requirement. Conventional performance psychology assumes that success comes from maintaining consistent identity while adapting behavior, McGregor explained during a debrief session following a particularly complex day that had required multiple configurations. That framework creates inherent limitation because behavior emerging from non-optimized identity always requires translation, always contains friction. The alternative is recognizing that optimal performance in different domains isn't about adapting output, but reconfiguring the source from which output emerges. 6 months into my role, I understood that the frameworks I was helping implement represented a fundamental reinvention of identity psychology. Rather than developing more adaptive expressions of fixed identity, the focus of most psychological approaches, McGregor had created systems for engineering and deploying specific identity configurations optimized for particular performance requirements. And this insight helped explain perhaps the most distinctive characteristic of McGregor's career: his unprecedented success across domains that typically require fundamentally different psychological orientation, from the controlled violence of combat sports to the nuanced relationship dynamics of high-level business to the strategic narrative construction of media promotion to the subtle status navigation of celebrity social context. What observers attributed to natural charisma or adaptability was actually the expression of sophisticated identity engineering, the systematic construction and deployment of specific operational architecture optimized for particular performance domains. This wasn't the adaptability or versatility I had studied in conventional psychology. It was something far more technical and precise, a comprehensive methodology for identity configuration that transformed the foundational structure from which performance emerged rather than merely adjusting the performance itself. Chapter 6: The Environmental Priming Protocol. 7 months into working with McGregor's team, I gained insight into another sophisticated component of his psychological framework, what internal documents called the Environmental Priming Protocol. This wasn't simple environment management or context optimization as understood in conventional psychology, but a technical approach to engineering external conditions specifically designed to trigger and reinforce internal patterns. My understanding of this framework deepened through direct involvement in implementing the protocol during preparation for a high-profile public appearance that would involve complex social dynamics, media interaction, and business relationship development simultaneously. Rather than conventional preparation focused on messaging or social strategy, McGregor's approach involved sophisticated environmental engineering that revealed another dimension of his psychological methodology. Today you'll observe the complete EPP implementation, McGregor instructed, as we entered a planning space where several team members had already assembled. This protocol addresses a fundamental performance variable, the reciprocal relationship between internal state and external environment. What followed was a methodical process that illuminated a core component of what many perceive as McGregor's ability to dominate diverse social contexts. The protocol consisted of 3 integrated phases, each addressing different aspects of environmental engineering. The first phase, called signal mapping, involves systematically identifying and categorizing the specific environmental elements that would be present during the upcoming event, from physical space characteristics and sensory variables to social dynamics and status hierarchy. Rather than treating these as fixed conditions to be navigated, this process mapped them as malleable variables that could be specifically engineered. Conventional preparation approaches environment as fixed context requiring adaptation, McGregor explained as he directed this mapping process with remarkable precision. That framework contains a fundamental surrender, accepting that external conditions determine internal response. The alternative is recognizing that environment is a technical variable that can be specifically engineered to generate particular internal states and external responses. The second phase, termed state trigger engineering, was perhaps the most technically sophisticated. Rather than planning behavior within anticipated environmental conditions, McGregor and his team engaged in a systematic process of reconfiguring specific environmental elements to function as precise triggers for particular psychological states and response patterns. What fascinated me about this phase was how it inverted the conventional relationship between environment and performance. Instead of developing strategy to perform effectively within existing conditions, the team was methodically engineering the conditions themselves to automatically activate specific performance patterns without requiring conscious management. Most people develop adaptation to environment techniques for managing existing conditions, McGregor noted as he directed specific modifications to everything from physical positioning to lighting to social introduction. That creates perpetual adaptation requirements, assuming attention better allocated to primary objective. This system engineers environment specifically to activate pre-established patterns, eliminating adaptation requirements entirely. The third phase, called integration testing, focused on verifying the alignment between engineered environmental triggers and internal response patterns, using simulated scenarios incorporating the specific environmental elements that would be present during the event. McGregor methodically tested and refined the relationship between external conditions and internal state activation, ensuring what he called seamless induction rather than conscious transition. Conventional approaches create perpetual translation between environment and response, he explained as he moved through these verification sequences. This protocol eliminates translation requirements by engineering perfect alignment between environmental triggers and internal patterns, creating automatic state activation without conscious mediation. As the preparation concluded, McGregor offered an insight that illuminated the entire framework. Environmental mastery, as conventionally understood, means effectively navigating existing conditions. True environmental mastery is condition engineering, creating specific external variables precisely calibrated to generate particular internal states and external responses. At the event that evening, I observed the protocol's effectiveness with new understanding. McGregor had arrived early with a specialized team who implemented subtle but significant modifications to the physical space and social dynamics, specific positioning of key interactions, particular lighting adjustments, strategic placement of certain individuals, even subtle acoustic modifications in key conversation areas. These weren't arbitrary preferences or status, but precisely engineered environmental triggers designed to activate specific psychological states and response patterns without requiring conscious management. As the event progressed, I witnessed these triggers systematically activate the exact internal patterns that had been established during earlier preparation phases, creating what appeared to observers as natural dominance of the social context, but was actually the product of sophisticated environment. Most revealing was observing how this environmental system interacted with the other psychological frameworks I had been documenting. The environmental triggers weren't separate from the reality constructions, calibrated response protocol, or identity leverage system, but functioned as activation mechanisms for these frameworks, creating immediate and automatic implementation without the performance degradation typically associated with conscious execution under complex social pressure. In the weeks that followed, I observed how this environmental priming protocol was implemented across diverse contexts, fighting venues, negotiation settings, media environments, even private social gatherings. While the specific environmental variables differed based on contextual requirements, the core methodology remained consistent, systematically mapping environmental signals, engineering specific triggers aligned with pre-established internal patterns, and verifying seamless activation without conscious mediation. Most significant was how this system explained what many perceived as McGregor's immediate command of diverse social environments. This wasn't natural charisma or social dominance in the conventional sense, but the expression of sophisticated environmental engineering, the systematic modification of external variables specifically designed to activate particular internal states and external external responses. Conventional performance psychology treats environment as context requiring adaptation, McGregor explained during a debrief session following a particularly successful business function. That framework creates inherent limitations because adaptation consumes processing capacity better allocated to primary objective. The alternative is recognizing that environment isn't fixed context but technical variable, something to be engineered rather than navigated. 8 months into my role, I understood that the frameworks I was helping implement represented a fundamental reinvention of environmental psychology. Rather than developing better techniques for adapting to existing conditions, the focus of most psychological approaches, McGregor had created systems for engineering external conditions specifically designed to automatically activate optimal internal states and response patterns. And this insight helped explain another distinctive characteristic of McGregor's career: his remarkable ability to immediately establish psychological dominance across radically different environments, from fighting venues to business settings to media context to high society functions. What observers attributed to natural presence or social power was actually the expression of sophisticated environmental engineering, the systematic construction of external conditions specifically designed to activate particular internal states and external responses. This wasn't the environmental adaptation or context management I had studied in conventional psychology. It was something far more technical and precise, a comprehensive methodology for engineering external conditions as specific activation mechanisms for internal patterns, eliminating the performance degradation typically associated with conscious adaptation to environmental variables. Chapter 7. The Strategic Provocation System. 9 months into working with McGregor's team, I gained insight into one of the most controversial aspects of his psychological framework, what internal documents called the Strategic Provocation SPS. This wasn't simple trash talk or mind games as portrayed in media, but a sophisticated approach to engineering specific cognitive and emotional states in others, particularly opponents and negotiation counterparts. My understanding of this framework deepened through direct involvement in implementing the protocol during preparation for a high-stakes negotiation with a particularly difficult counterpart, known for aggressive tactic and emotional volatility. Rather than conventional preparation focused on defensive positioning or response planning, McGregor's approach involved precise offensive psychology that revealed another dimension of his methodology. Today, you'll document the complete SPS implementation, McGregor instructed as we entered the strategy room early on the morning of the negotiation. This protocol addresses a fundamental competitive variable, the capacity to systematically engineer specific psychological states in others rather than merely responding. What followed was a methodical process that illuminated what many had misinterpreted as McGregor's natural gift for getting under opponents' skin. The protocol consisted of 3 integrated phases, each addressing different aspects of strategic psychological engineering. The first phase, called State Vulnerability Mapping, involved systematically identifying and categorizing specific psychological vulnerabilities in the negotiation counterpart, particular trigger points, cognitive biases, emotional sensitivities, and response patterns that could be strategically activated. Rather than general personality assessment, this was precise vulnerability cartography, mapping specific activation thresholds across multiple psychological dimensions. Conventional preparation focuses on understanding general personality or negotiation, McGregor explained as he directed this mapping process with remarkable precision. That framework creates limited leverage because it addresses surface behavior rather than underlying psychological mechanism. This system maps specific vulnerability points where precisely calibrated input can generate predictable state changes. The second phase, termed Response Pattern Design, was the most technically sophisticated. Rather than planning general provocative approaches or pressure tactics, McGregor and his team engaged in a systematic process of designing specific linguistic, behavioral, and situational patterns precisely calibrated to activate particular psychological states in the counterpart. What fascinated me about this phase was how it transcended conventional understanding of psychological influence. This wasn't manipulation in the general sense, but precision engineering, creating specific input patterns designed to generate predictable psychological responses with remarkable consistency. Most influence attempts involve general pressure or persuasion, McGregor noted as he methodically constructed response patterns. That creates inconsistent results because the mechanisms are imprecise. This system designed specific activation patterns calibrated to trigger particular psychological states with high reliability. The third phase, called Delivery Sequence, focused on precisely timing and contextualizing the engineered patterns for maximum effectiveness. Rather than opportunistic deployment, this involved systematic sequencing of specific provocations relative to environmental conditions, physiological states, social context, and prior interaction, creating what McGregor called inevitable activation rather than possible influence. Conventional approaches treat timing as general opportunity, he explained as he mapped specific deployments. This protocol treats timing as precise variable, engineering exactly when and how specific patterns are introduced relative to multiple contextual factors to ensure maximum state activation. As the preparation sequence concluded, McGregor offered an insight that illuminated the entire framework. Psychological influence, as conventionally understood, means applying general pressure or persuasion, hoping for favorable response. True psychological engineering is state activation, delivering precisely calibrated input patterns that generate specific psychological states with high predictability. In the negotiation that followed, I observed the system's effectiveness with new understanding. What appeared to observers spontaneous comments or natural interaction dynamics were actually precisely engineered provocations specifically designed to activate particular psychological states in the counterpart. Most remarkable was observing how these activations systematically compromised the counterpart's decision quality, strategic positioning, and perception management, without them recognizing the engineered nature of their state changes. Most revealing was a specific sequence I had documented during the morning preparation. McGregor had designed a particular provocation pattern involving specific linguistic framing, timing relative to negotiation phase, and contextual positioning. When deployed during a critical negotiation moment, it activated precisely the emotional and cognitive state changes that had been predicted, creating negotiation leverage that appeared to emerge naturally from the counterpart's own behavior rather than external engineering. In the weeks that followed, I observed how this strategic provocation was implemented across diverse contexts: fighting promotion, media interaction, business negotiation, even internal team dynamics when necessary. While the specific activation patterns varied based on target psychology and contextual requirement, the core methodology remained consistent, systematically mapping psychological vulnerabilities, designing precise response patterns, and sequencing deployment for maximum effectiveness. Most significant was how this system explained what many considered McGregor's most controversial talent: his seemingly preternatural ability to provoke specific reactions from opponents, often leading to compromised performance through emotional disruption or strategic distraction. This wasn't natural charisma or psychological intuition, as commonly assumed, but the expression of sophisticated psychological engineering, the systematic design and deployment of specific provocations calibrated to trigger particular states with high predictability. Conventional competitive psychology focuses on managing your own state while adapting to opponents, McGregor explained during a debrief session following a particularly effective media interaction. That framework creates inherent limitation because it positions you as responder rather than initiator. The alternative is recognizing that others' psychological states aren't fixed variables, but technical outcomes, something to be engineered rather than accommodated. 10 months into my role, I understood that the frameworks I was helping implement represented a fundamental reinvention of competitive psychology. Rather than developing better techniques for managing one's own state under competitive pressure, the focus of most psychological approaches, McGregor had created systems for engineering specific states in others that created predictable competitive advantages. And this insight helped explain one of the most distinctive patterns in McGregor's career: the remarkably consistent way opponents seemed to deviate from established strategies when facing him, often abandoning successful approaches in favor of emotional engagement that compromised their performance. What observers attributed to McGregor's provocative personality or psychological warfare was actually the expression of sophisticated state engineering, the systematic activation of specific cognitive and emotional patterns designed to create predictable performance compromise. This wasn't the mental warfare or psychological pressure I had studied in conventional sports science. It was something far more technical and precise, a comprehensive methodology for engineering specific psychological states in others with the same technical precision that his other systems applied to engineering his own performance. Chapter 8. The Narrative Construction Framework. 11 months into working with McGregor's team, I gained insight into another sophisticated component of his psychological approach, what internal documents called the Narrative Construction Framework, NCF. This wasn't simple story creation or brand building, as understood in conventional marketing, but a technical approach to engineering specific reality interpretations across audience segments. My understanding of this framework deepened through direct involvement in preparing for a major career announcement that required managing perception across multiple stakeholder groups with divergent interests and expectations. Rather than conventional communication planning focused on messaging or media strategy, McGregor's approach involved sophisticated narrative engineering that revealed another dimension of his psychological methodology. Today, you'll observe the complete NCF implementation, McGregor instructed as we entered a specialized workspace where several team members had already assembled. This protocol addresses a fundamental perception variable, the capacity to engineer how reality is interpreted rather than merely describing it. What followed was a methodical process that illuminated a core component of what many perceived as McGregor's marketing genius and promotional talent. The protocol consisted of 3 integrated phases, each addressing different aspects of narrative engineering. The first phase, called interpretation mapping, involved systematically identifying how specific audience segments would naturally interpret the upcoming announcement based on existing frameworks, biases, expectations, and contextual factors. Rather than general audience analysis, this was precise cognitive cartography, mapping specific interpretation vulnerabilities across multiple perception dimensions. Conventional communication focuses on crafting messages for audience reception, McGregor explained, as he directed this mapping process with remarkable precision. That framework creates limited effectiveness because it addresses surface reception rather than underlying interpretation mechanisms. This system maps specific points where precisely calibrated narrative elements can redirect interpretation patterns. The second phase, termed reality frame construction, was the most technically sophisticated. Rather than developing general narratives or key messages, McGregor and his team engaged in a systematic process of engineering specific reality frames, particular cognitive structures through which the announcement would be interpreted by different audience segments. What fascinated me about this phase was how it transcended conventional understanding of communication influence. This wasn't persuasion in the general sense, but reality engineering, creating specific interpretive frameworks designed to generate predictable meaning construction with remarkable consistency across diverse audience segments. Most communication attempts involve message dissemination, hoping for favorable interpretation, McGregor noted as he methodically constructed these reality frames. That creates inconsistent results because the mechanisms are imprecise. This system designs specific interpretation structure that direct how reality itself is constructed by each audience segment. The third phase, called deployment sequence, focused on precisely timing and contextualizing the engineered frames for maximum effectiveness. Rather than simultaneous broad release, this involved systematic sequencing of specific narrative elements across different channels, timing windows, and contextual environment, creating what McGregor called interpretation inevitability rather than possible influence. Conventional approaches treat timing as general opportunity, he explained, as he mapped specific deployments. This protocol treats timing as precise variable, engineering exactly when and how specific narrative elements are introduced relative to multiple contextual factors to ensure maximum interpretation direction. As the preparations concluded, McGregor offered an insight that illuminated the entire framework. Communication, as conventionally understood, means transmitting messages, hoping for favorable reception. True narrative engineering is reality, delivering precisely calibrated interpretation framework that generates specific reality with high predictability. When the announcement was made through carefully sequenced channels over the following days, I observed the system's effectiveness with new understanding. What appeared to observers as a unified story, naturally interpreted by different audiences, was actually multiple precisely engineered reality frames specifically designed to generate particular interpretation across diverse stakeholder segments. Most revealing was observing how these frames systematically directed not just what audiences thought about the announcement, but how they thought about it, the specific cognitive structures through which the information was processed and meaning constructed. This wasn't simple message reception, but fundamental reality interpretation, with each audience segment constructing specific meaning that aligned with McGregor's strategic objective, despite their divergent starting position. In the weeks that followed, I observed how this narrative construction framework was implemented across diverse contexts, fighting promotion, business announcement, personal brand development, even response management during controversy. While the specific reality frames varied based on audience psychology and strategic objective, the core methodology remained consistent, systematically mapping interpretation vulnerabilities, designing precise reality frames, and sequencing deployment for maximum effectiveness. Most significant was how this system explained what many considered McGregor's most valuable talent, his seemingly intuitive ability to generate massive public interest and engagement across events that similar athletes couldn't effectively promote. This wasn't natural charisma or marketing intuition, as commonly assumed, but the expression of sophisticated narrative engineering. The systematic design and deployment of specific reality frames calibrated to generate particular interpretations with high predictability. Conventional promotion focuses on describing reality attractively, McGregor explained during a debrief session following a particularly successful campaign. That framework creates inherent limitations because it positions you as describer rather than constructor. The alternative is recognizing that reality interpretation isn't fixed reception, but technical outcome, something to be engineered rather than hoped for. 12 months into my role, I understood that the frameworks I was helping implement represented a fundamental reinvention of communication psychology. Rather than developing better techniques for message crafting and delivery, the focus of most communication approaches, McGregor had created systems for engineering specific reality construction that generated predictable interpretation outcomes across diverse audience segments. And this insight helped explain one of the most distinctive patterns in McGregor's career, his unprecedented ability to transform fight promotion from simple event marketing to cultural phenomena that transcended traditional combat sports. Or what observers attributed to natural promotional talent or communication charisma was actually the expression of sophisticated narrative engineering, the systematic construction of reality frames specifically designed to generate particular interpretation patterns across diverse audience segments. This wasn't the communication strategy or brand building I had studied in conventional marketing psychology. It was something far more technical and precise, a comprehensive methodology for engineering specific reality constructions in others, with the same technical precision that his other systems applied to engineering performance states and environmental conditions. Chapter 9. The Integrated Confidence Framework. In my final month working with McGregor's team, an unexpected opportunity provided perfect clarity on everything I had observed throughout the year, bringing into focus the essential nature of his approach to confidence and performance psychology. The opportunity arose when McGregor decided to document key elements of his psychological methodology for potential future development. As part of this process, I was tasked with organizing a comprehensive session to articulate how the individual systems I had been studying throughout the year functioned as an integrated framework. Today, we'll map the complete confidence architecture, McGregor explained as we entered a specialized workspace where multiple displays had been arranged to visualize different components. Not the individual protocols, but the integration architecture that connects them to a unified framework. What followed was a remarkable 6-hour session that illuminated how the seemingly separate systems I had been documenting, the reality constructions, calibrated response protocol, identity leverage system, environmental priming protocol, strategic provocations, and narrative construction framework, functioned not as isolated methodologies, but as integrated components of a comprehensive confidence architecture. The fundamental insight underlying the entire system is simple but profound, McGregor began, sketching a central diagram that would anchor the day's mapping. Confidence, as conventionally understood, is treated as an emotional state or psychological trait, something you build through experience, maintain through affirmation, and potentially lose through setback. He continued, articulating what I had gradually come to recognize as his core philosophical framework. That conventional understanding creates inherent vulnerability because it positions confidence as reactive outcome rather than generative system, something dependent on external validation and internal emotion rather than technical implementation. What McGregor proceeded to map was a fundamentally different conceptualization of confidence, not as psychological state, but as integrated operating system composed of specific technical components working in concert to generate particular performance outcomes regardless of circumstantial variation. True confidence isn't feeling certain about positive outcome, he explained as he connected various system elements on the central diagram. It's operating through specific reality construction framework that makes certain forms of performance inevitable, regardless of how you feel or what circumstances arise. The mapping revealed how each system I had studied throughout the year addressed a different dimension of this integrated framework. The reality constructions established specific perceptual filters and processing frameworks through which situations were experienced, creating what McGregor called reality inevitability rather than reality response. The calibrated response protocol established specific neurological sequence that activated automatically under pressure conditions, creating what he termed response inevitability rather than response choice. The identity leverage system established specific operational architectures optimized for particular performance, creating what he described as expression inevitability rather than expression effort. The environmental priming protocol established specific external triggers precisely aligned with internal patterns, creating what he called state inevitability rather than state management. The strategic provocation system established specific activation mechanisms for engineering advantageous psychological states in others, creating what he termed interaction inevitability rather than interaction adaptation. The narrative construction framework established specific interpretation structures across audience segments, creating what he described as perception inevitability rather than perception hope. What became clear through this comprehensive mapping was that McGregor's legendary confidence wasn't a psychological trait or emotional characteristic, but the emergent property of sophisticated systems working in concert to create specific forms of performance inevitability across diverse domains and challenges. Conventional psychology attempts to build confidence through affirming belief in positive outcomes, McGregor observed as the mapping neared completion. That approach creates fundamental vulnerability because belief is inherently fragile, subject to evidence, circumstance, and emotional state. The alternative, constructing systems that generate specific forms of performance regardless of belief, circumstance, or state. This perspective illuminated what distinguished McGregor's approach from conventional confidence development. He wasn't working to believe more strongly in positive outcomes or manage emotional states more effectively under pressure. He had developed sophisticated systems for making certain forms of performance inevitable, regardless of belief or emotional state, eliminating the relevance of conventional confidence entirely, rather than trying to enhance it. Most revealing was McGregor's explanation of how this framework had evolved throughout his career. The early versions were intuitive rather than technical, he explained, referencing his early fighting. I had discovered through experience that certain approaches to reality construction, response patterning, and identity configuration created performance advantage, but hadn't yet developed the technical understanding to systematically replicate or optimize. He continued, describing the evolution into formal methodology. The transition from intuitive application to technicals happened when I began precisely mapping what worked, why it worked, and how it could be engineered rather than merely repeated. That transformation created frameworks that could be systematically implemented rather than states that had to be continuously generated. This insight helped explain a pattern I had observed in studying McGregor's career progression, the remarkable consistency with which his confidence expressed itself across radically different challenges and circumstances. This wasn't psychological resilience, conventional, but systematic implementation, confidence as technical execution rather than emotional maintenance. The fundamental advantage is predictability, McGregor noted as we concluded the mappings. Conventional confidence is inherently unpredictable, present in certain circumstances, absent in others, always vulnerable to evidence and emotion. Systematic confidence is technically predictable, present whenever the systems are properly implemented, regardless of circumstance or emotion. In the days that followed this comprehensive mapping, I observed McGregor's preparation for an upcoming business initiative with new understanding. What had initially appeared as separate protocols now revealed themselves as integrated components of a unified confidence architecture, each addressing different dimensions of performance inevitability while working in concert to create the remarkable consistency that defined his career. Most significant was recognizing how this integrated framework explained what many considered McGregor's most distinctive characteristic, his ability to maintain absolute performance certainty across radically different domains and challenges without the vulnerability typically associated with confidence dependent on evidence, experience, or emotional state. Conventional approaches treat confidence psychologically. You build success and struggle to maintain through challenge, McGregor explained during our final strategy. That framework creates inherently because it positions confidence as fragile outcome rather than robust. The alternative is recognize isn't feel a technical execution rather than an emotional. As I completed my final month in the role, I understood that the frameworks I had been documenting represented a fundamental reinvention of confidence psychology. Rather than developing better techniques for generating and maintaining confident states, the focus of most psychological approaches, McGregor had created integrated or established forms of performance inevitability that operated independently of emotional entirely. And this insight finally answered the question that had initially intrigued me about McGregor's career. How someone from a working-class Dublin neighbourhood with no particular advantage had developed the extraordinary confidence to not only declare unprecedented ambition, but systematically achieve them across domains where such cross-contextual success was virtually unknown. The answer wasn't psychological resilience, natural self-belief, or emotional management as conventionally understood. It was the systematic development and implementation of sophisticated frameworks for reality construction, response calibration, identity leverage, environmental priming, strategic provocation, and narrative engineering. Integrated components of a comprehensive confidence architecture that generated specific forms of performance inevitability regardless of circumstance, evidence, or emotional. Chapter 10. The Understanding. In my final week working with McGregor's team, an unexpected situation provided the perfect synthesis of everything I had observed throughout the year, bringing into focus the essential nature of his approach to confidence and performance psychology. The situation arose when a documentary crew arrived to film segments about McGregor's business venture and training methodology. As part of my responsibilities, I was coordinating certain aspects of this production, ensuring appropriate access while maintaining operational protocols. What I hadn't anticipated was witnessing an extraordinary contrast between public persona and private methodology, a moment that crystallized my understanding of everything I had been documenting throughout the year. The documentary director had requested footage of McGregor's mental preparation and confidence-building practice, clearly expecting to capture conventional visualization, affirmation, or motivational routines. What followed was a revealing sequence that perfectly illustrated the gap between conventional understanding of confidence and the sophisticated system I had been studying. For the cameras, McGregor provided exactly what was expected: charismatic declarations about self-belief, demonstrations of visualization practice, engaging stories about maintaining confidence through adversity. The crew captured compelling footage that perfectly aligned with public expectations of how an elite fighter develops and maintains the psychological edge necessary for championship performance. When the crew departed for the day, I observed McGregor immediately transition to his actual preparations, the precise protocols I had been documenting throughout the year. In place of the general visualization and affirmation shown for the cameras, he engaged in the specific reality construction system protocols that established particular perceptual filters and processing frameworks. Instead of the motivation techniques demonstrated for the documentary, he implemented precise calibrated response protocols and identity leverage systems. This stark contrast between public narrative and private methodology perfectly illustrated what I had come to recognize as the core insight underlying McGregor's entire approach: the fundamental difference between confidence as culturally understood and confidence as technically implemented. Later that evening, as we reviewed certain data from the day's protocol, McGregor addressed this contrast directly. What people call confidence exists in two entirely different forms, he observed. The first is what was captured on camera: emotional state generated through motivation, maintained through affirmation, and vulnerable to circumstantial variation. The second is what we actually implement: technical system established through specific protocols, maintained through precise execution, and independent of emotional state or circumstantial condition. He continued, articulating what I had come to recognize as his fundamental reframing performance psychology. The first form makes for better documentaries and more relatable stories. The second form creates actual performance advantages and predictable outcomes. The public narrative about confidence serves a purpose. It's what people expect and can relate to. But the technical reality of confidence is something entirely different. This perspective illuminated everything I had observed throughout the year. McGregor hadn't rejected conventional confidence narratives. He had weaponized, using public expectations about psychological preparation as strategic asset, while implementing something far more sophisticated behind closed doors. The charismatic declarations of self-belief, the confident prediction of specific outcomes, the apparent emotional certainty in the face of formidable challenges, these weren't the sources of his performance advantages, but their public expression. The actual advantages came from the sophisticated systems operating beneath the visible surface: reality construction frameworks, response calibration protocols, identity leverage systems, environmental priming methodologies, strategic provocation architecture, and narrative engineering platform. The fundamental insight that transformed my career wasn't learning how to believe more strongly in positive outcomes, McGregor explained, as we concluded our evening review. It was recognizing that belief itself is largely irrelevant to performance when proper systems are implemented. The question isn't whether you believe, it's whether you've established conditions that make specific forms of performance inevitable, regardless of what you. This insight helped explain a pattern I had observed in studying McGregor's career: the remarkable precision with which he had predicted specific fight outcomes, often down to the exact round and method of victory. These weren't acts of belief or even strategic intimidation as commonly assumed. They were natural extensions of reality construction so thoroughly established that specific outcomes became perceptually inevitable rather than merely possible or probable. Most fighters hope to win while fearing loss, with performance emerging from that emotional tension, McGregor noted. That creates inherent inconsistency because emotional states are naturally variable. The alternative is establishing specific reality construction frameworks and response calibration systems that generate particular performance patterns regardless of emotional state. On my final day, as I completed the transition of my responsibility successor, McGregor offered a perspective that perfectly captured the essence of what I had been privileged to witness throughout the year. The public narrative about my confidence serves a purpose and contains its own strategic value, he observed. But the technical reality is something different entirely. What people perceive as unshakable self-belief is actually systematic implementation, confidence as executed protocol rather than emotional state. He continued, articulating what I had come to recognize as his most significant innovation. The greatest competitive advantage isn't believing more strongly than others in positive outcomes. It's operating through systems that make positive outcomes technically inevitable, while others remain dependent on belief, emotion, and circumstance. As I drove away from McGregor's estate for the final time, I reflected on what I had been privileged to witness throughout the year. The Conor McGregor known to the public was remarkable. His charismatic declarations of self-belief, precise fight prediction, and apparent psychological indomitability. But the Conor McGregor I had observed daily was even more remarkable for something largely invisible to external view: the sophisticated systems through which specific forms of performance became technically inevitable rather than emotionally hoped for. This wasn't the confidence psychology I had studied in graduate program or implemented in my previous work with athletes. It was something far more sophisticated, an integrated framework for establishing performance inevitability through technical implementation rather than emotional generation, and it helped explain how a fighter from a working-class Dublin neighborhood with no particular advantages had developed the extraordinary performance to not only declare unprecedented ambition, but systematically achieve them across domains where such cross-contextual success was virtually unknown. The secret behind Conor McGregor's confidence wasn't self-belief, emotional management, or psychological resilience as conventionally understood. It was the systematic development and implementation of sophisticated frameworks for reality construction, response calibration, identity leverage, environmental priming, strategic provocation, and narrative engineering. Integrated components of a comprehensive performance architecture that operated independently of the very emotional states most people consider essential to confidence. In this lay the true significance of what I had witnessed, not just innovative psychological techniques, but a fundamental reframing of confidence itself, from emotional state dependent on circumstantial evidence to technical system independent of both emotion and circumstance. And in that reframing lay insights, not just about athletic performance, but about human capability more broadly, about the extraordinary possibilities that become available when we move beyond conventional understanding of confidence as something we feel to confidence as something we systematically implement.